In the heart of the North Carolina woods, where the trees pressed close together like spectators at a funeral, stood an old roadside inn. It was the kind of place that would go unnoticed if you weren't looking for it. Faded paint peeling from the walls, a sign hanging crookedly that read Riley's Retreat, and a faint, musty smell that seemed to cling to the very air. It was late October when Karen and Dave found themselves lost. Their GPS had given out hours ago, and the last known road they had been on had twisted into a narrow, overgrown path. Exhausted and desperate, they spotted the inn's dim light glowing through the trees, a beacon of hope in the darkness. The innkeeper, an elderly man with a wrinkled face and weary eyes, greeted them. "We don't get many travelers this time of year," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "You must be tired. Rooms are $50 a night." Karen and Dave exchanged a glance. The place was far from welcoming, but they had little choice. They paid and followed the innkeeper down a creaky, dimly lit corridor. The wooden floors groaned beneath their feet, and the walls were lined with dusty, forgotten paintings. Their room was no better. It was small, with a single bed and a moth-eaten armchair. A faded quilt lay on the bed, and the only window looked out onto the dark forest. Karen sat down on the bed, trying to ignore the chill that settled over her. Dave turned on the old, flickering television in the corner, but it only offered static. He shrugged and went to the bathroom to wash up. Karen sat by the window, staring out at the encroaching darkness. The silence was thick, almost oppressive. She felt as though the forest was closing in on them. Its whispers carried on the wind. After a while, Dave emerged from the bathroom, his face pale. "Karen, you need to see this," he said, his voice strained. Karen followed him into the bathroom. The mirror was smeared with what looked like dried blood. The room had a musty, coppery smell, and she could see faint handprints smeared on the tiles. "Probably just a prank," Dave suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Or a sign of something much worse," Karen replied, her unease growing. They decided to go downstairs to speak with the innkeeper. The common area was empty, save for a flickering fire in the fireplace and a few dusty old armchairs. The innkeeper was nowhere to be seen. As they approached the front desk, they noticed something strange, an old ledger with entries in an ancient script. Karen ran her fingers over the pages, noticing a pattern. Each entry was dated with names that matched their own. "Dave, look at this," she whispered, showing him the ledger. Dave's eyes widened. The names and dates were eerily familiar, and there was a chilling realization that struck them both. These were names of people who had stayed at the inn over the years, each with their own unsettling end. "Maybe it's just an old ledger," Dave said, trying to stay calm. "Let's go back to our room and think this through." But when they returned, their room had changed. The bed was now perfectly made, the armchair neatly positioned, and the window was boarded up from the outside. Panic set in. Suddenly, the lights went out. Karen and Dave fumbled in the darkness, their breaths coming in sharp, ragged gasps. They stumbled towards the door, but it was locked from the outside. A cold, mocking laugh echoed through the corridors. In the pitch blackness, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching. They pressed themselves against the wall, hoping to stay hidden. The innkeeper's voice floated through the darkness, distant yet near. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice chillingly calm. "You've awakened something that was meant to remain buried." The footsteps grew closer. Dave, with a surge of adrenaline, managed to break open a small window in the room. He and Karen crawled out, their hearts pounding as they tumbled into the damp, leaf-strewn ground outside. They sprinted through the forest, branches tearing at their clothes and the ground slippery beneath their feet. The forest seemed alive, whispering and shifting, its shadows writhing like sentient entities. They finally stumbled upon a dirt road, its surface cracked and uneven. A car approached in the distance, its headlights cutting through the darkness. They waved frantically, and the car screeched to a halt. Inside were two young travelers, their faces showing concern as Karen and Dave climbed into the back seat, breathless and wide-eyed. The travelers offered to take them to the nearest town. As the car sped away from the inn, Karen and Dave looked back one last time. The inn was now completely engulfed in darkness, as if it had never existed. They arrived at a small town and immediately contacted the authorities. The police conducted a search but found nothing but an empty lot where Riley's retreat had stood. No records of the inn or its owner could be found. Days later, back in their own home, they found it impossible to shake the feeling that they were being watched. They had escaped the physical horror of the inn, but the psychological scars remained. They tried to tell their story, but no one believed them. The inn had vanished as though it had never existed, leaving only a lingering terror in its wake. As they lay in bed one night, Karen noticed something strange on the nightstand. An old photograph, faded and yellowed with age, showed a group of people in front of a dilapidated inn. At the bottom was the inscription, "Welcome to Riley's Retreat, where no one leaves." A chill ran down Karen's spine as she realized the photograph had been taken years before, showing not just the inn, but the same old innkeeper standing among the guests. The terror of Riley's Retreat was not just a story of a haunted place, it was a curse that had followed them, hidden in plain sight. They had escaped the inn, but the darkness it had unleashed was far from over. The end.
The Whispering Pines.
Anna and Mark were on their way to visit an old family cabin, a place they hadn't seen in years. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, the cabin was a relic of their childhood, fond memories of summers spent fishing, hiking, and exploring. The winding road leading to the cabin was barely more than a dirt path, surrounded by dense forest and tall pines that seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. The sky was overcast, and a light drizzle began as they drove. They laughed and reminisced, their voices a comforting contrast to the growing unease of the forest around them. They hadn't been to the cabin in over a decade, but it was still a place of solace and familiarity. After a few hours, they finally reached the cabin. It was just as they remembered it, weathered but standing strong, with its wooden exterior fading into the surrounding trees. They unloaded their bags and settled in for the night. The rain pelted against the windows, creating a soothing rhythm that made the cabin feel cozy and secure. As darkness fell, Anna noticed something odd, a faint whispering that seemed to come from the trees. At first, she dismissed it as the wind, but as the hours passed, the whispers grew louder and more distinct. It sounded almost like someone was trying to speak, though the words were unintelligible. "Mark, do you hear that?" Anna asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Hear what?" Mark replied, his eyes glued to the flickering fireplace. "It sounds like someone is talking outside," Anna said, her unease growing. Mark chuckled. "It's probably just the wind. We're in the middle of nowhere, remember? Trees can make all sorts of noises." Anna tried to dismiss her growing discomfort, but sleep was elusive. She lay awake, listening to the persistent whispers. Around midnight, she decided to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The rain now reduced to a gentle drizzle. The forest was eerily silent except for the whispers, which seemed to come from deeper within the woods. She followed the sound, pushing through the thick underbrush. The whispers grew louder, taking on a more urgent tone. It was as if they were beckoning her. Eventually, she stumbled upon an old, abandoned well. The stone structure was partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. The whispers seemed to emanate from within the well, and as she approached, she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She peered into the darkness, but saw nothing. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. Anna stood in the silence, her heart pounding. She turned to head back to the cabin when she heard a rustling in the bushes behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing there, just the shadowy shapes of the trees. She hurried back to the cabin, her mind racing. When she returned, Mark was waiting for her, a concerned look on his face. "Where did you go? I was about to come looking for you," he said, his voice tight with worry. "I heard something," Anna said, trying to catch her breath. "It was coming from the well." Mark's face paled. "There's something strange about that well," he said. "I remember Grandpa telling us stories about it. He said people used to hear voices coming from it, and some of them even disappeared." Anna's eyes widened. "Disappeared? What do you mean?" "Disappeared. Some people would go looking for whatever was calling them and would never come back," Mark explained. "Grandpa said it was cursed or something." Anna's skin crawled. They locked up the cabin and went to bed, but neither of them slept well. The whispers outside resumed, growing louder and more frantic. They were joined by an occasional mournful cry, like someone in distress. The next morning, the whispers had stopped, and the forest was unnervingly quiet. They decided to leave the cabin and return home, their once beloved retreat now a source of fear. As they packed their things, Anna noticed a small, weathered journal lying on the floor of the cabin. Curious, she opened it. The pages were filled with scribbled notes, dated over a period of years. The entries were about the whispers and the well, written by someone who had clearly become obsessed with the voices. The final entry was a frantic scrawl. "The well calls to me. I must go. The voices want me." Anna showed the journal to Mark. His face went pale as he read the final entry. "This is from someone who stayed here before us. They must have been driven mad by those whispers." As they hurried to leave, Anna glanced back at the well. The whispering had started again, softer now, as if it were bidding them farewell. They drove away from the cabin, their hearts heavy with the weight of what they had experienced. The forest seemed to close in behind them, the trees swaying as if whispering secrets only they could understand. Weeks later, back in the safety of their home, Anna and Mark tried to move on, but the whispers remained with them, haunting their dreams and filling their waking hours with dread. No matter where they went, they felt as if they were being followed, the whispers a constant, creeping presence. One night, as they lay in bed, Anna noticed something strange, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper in the darkness. She strained to hear, but it was too soft, too distant. Mark, asleep beside her, stirred at the sound. Anna held her breath, her eyes darting around the room. The whispers grew louder, clearer. They were unmistakably saying her name. Anna. The sound was coming from the darkness around her, closing in like a shroud. She turned to Mark, but he was asleep, his face serene and untroubled. The whispers grew more insistent, filled with a mournful, almost pleading tone. Anna's heart raced as she tried to wake Mark, but as she reached out to him, she realized with mounting horror that his body was becoming transparent, fading away into the darkness. "Mark?" she screamed, but the room was empty now, consumed by the whispering void. Anna was alone, the whispers all around her, drawing her into the darkness. The last thing she heard before the silence swallowed her was her own name, whispered with a chilling finality. The end. The forgotten house. The house on the outskirts of the small town of Coldwater had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. It was a crumbling Victorian mansion, its once grand facade now a tangle of ivy and rot. The windows were boarded up, and the paint had peeled away long ago. Local legend claimed that the house was cursed, but no one knew exactly why. One crisp October evening, Emily and Jake, two adventurous college students, decided to investigate the old mansion. They were drawn by the mystery of the place and the thrill of exploring an abandoned building. They arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the dilapidated structure. The air was thick with the scent of decay and mold. Emily, her flashlight bobbing as she walked, led the way to the front door, which creaked open with a reluctant groan. Inside, the house was a labyrinth of dust-covered furniture and cobwebs. The air was stale, and every step they took seemed to disturb the silence that had settled over the place. The walls were adorned with faded, peeling wallpaper, and the floorboards creaked ominously underfoot. Jake's curiosity led him to explore the main hallway, while Emily made her way to the grand staircase. The steps were narrow and steep, and the banister was covered in a thick layer of dust. She climbed slowly, the beams of her flashlight revealing the intricate carvings on the wooden walls. When she reached the second floor, she found a long corridor lined with closed doors. The first few rooms were empty, their contents long since rotted away. As she approached the end of the hallway, she noticed a door slightly ajar, the gap revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. Emily pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small and cluttered, filled with old furniture draped in white sheets. The air was colder here, and she shivered as she moved towards a large antique mirror covered with a cloth. She hesitated for a moment before pulling the cloth away. The mirror's surface was cracked and dirty, but Emily could still make out a shadowy figure standing behind her. Her breath caught in her throat as she spun around, but the room was empty. Her heart raced, and she felt a chill run down her spine. She turned back to the mirror and noticed something peculiar, a faint, almost imperceptible movement in the reflection. It was as if the shadows were shifting on their own, forming vague, indistinct shapes. Emily's flashlight flickered, and she struggled to keep calm. She decided to leave the room and find Jake. As she retraced her steps, she heard a low, guttural sound coming from the direction of the main hallway. "Jake?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. The sound grew louder, a series of rhythmic thuds that seemed to echo through the house. She rushed back down the stairs, her flashlight casting erratic beams of light across the walls. The thudding sound was now accompanied by what seemed like muffled voices, whispering incoherently. When she reached the main hallway, she found Jake standing in the center of the room, staring blankly at the front door. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with terror. "Jake, what's wrong?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. I don't know," Jake stammered. "I just felt cold, and then I heard something. It felt like someone was watching me." Before Emily could respond, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The house was plunged into darkness as the flashlight's beam flickered and died. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the air with a sense of foreboding. Panic set in as Emily and Jake fumbled to find their way. They stumbled through the darkness, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The whispers seemed to follow them, growing louder and more urgent with every passing moment. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence was oppressive, and the only sound was the pounding of their own hearts. Emily and Jake huddled together, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The silence was shattered by a deafening crash. Emily turned to see a large, ornate chandelier hanging from the ceiling, its crystals shimmering in the faint light of the flashlight. The chandelier had fallen, shattering into a million pieces on the floor. As the dust settled, Emily noticed something strange among the debris, a small leather-bound book, its cover worn and faded. She picked it up, her hands trembling, and opened it. The pages were filled with handwritten notes and sketches. They described strange occurrences and disturbing events that had happened in the house over the years. The final entry was a frantic scrawl. "They're coming. They've been here all along." As Emily read the final entry, a cold, ghostly breeze swept through the room. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the air with an overwhelming sense of dread. Jake grabbed Emily's arm, his eyes wide with fear. "We have to get out of here. Now!" They ran towards the front door, but it remained firmly shut. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening. The walls seemed to close in on them, and the air grew thick with an oppressive, malevolent force. Emily and Jake fought against the unseen pressure, their desperation mounting with each passing second. They tried every door, every window, but nothing would open. The house seemed to be alive, resisting their escape. In a final frantic attempt, Emily slammed her shoulder against the front door. With a final resounding crack, the door gave way, and they tumbled outside into the cold night air. They ran as fast as they could, not daring to look back. As they reached the safety of their car, they glanced back at the mansion. The front door was now wide open, but the whispers had ceased. The house stood silent, its dark windows staring back at them like hollow eyes. Emily and Jake never spoke of their experience again. They left Coldwater and never returned. The house on the outskirts of town remained, a silent sentinel to the mysteries and terrors that lay within. And though they tried to move on, the whispers never truly left them. They were always just out of reach, a haunting reminder of the night they escaped the forgotten house. The end. The lantern's light. In the remote village of Eldridge, nestled deep within the mist-shrouded hills, there was an old legend about a lantern that guided lost souls to safety, or so the villagers believed. The tale was told to children to keep them away from the dangerous woods that bordered the village. It was said that if you saw the lantern's light, you should never follow it, no matter how tempting it seemed. One chilly autumn evening, Sophie and Alex, a couple of adventurous spirit and budding urban explorers, decided to investigate the legend. They had heard about the lantern from locals and were intrigued by the mystery surrounding it. Ignoring the warnings, they packed their gear and set out into the woods with nothing but their flashlights and a sense of excitement. The forest was dense and quiet, with only the sound of crunching leaves beneath their feet and the occasional hoot of an owl breaking the silence. As night fell, the moon cast eerie shadows through the trees, and the forest seemed to come alive with whispers carried on the wind. After several hours of walking, they came upon a clearing. In the center stood an old, weathered stone well. Its stones were covered in moss, and a faint, flickering light emanated from the depths. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. The light was unmistakable. It was the lantern's glow. Alex, equally intrigued, suggested they investigate. "Let's get closer and see if we can find anything," he said, his eyes glinting with curiosity. They approached the well cautiously. The light was soft but steady, casting strange, shifting shadows on the ground. Sophie peered into the well, but the light seemed to come from nowhere, its source hidden in the darkness below. "I don't like this," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "It feels wrong." "We've come this far," Alex replied, trying to sound braver than he felt. "Let's just check it out." He leaned over the edge of the well, trying to see the bottom. Suddenly, the light flickered and went out. They were plunged into darkness, their flashlights flickering in response. Panic set in as they tried to regain their bearings, their breaths coming in shallow, frightened gasps. Just as suddenly as it had gone out, the light flared back to life, brighter than before. But now, it seemed to be moving, dancing just beyond the edge of the clearing. It looked like a beacon, guiding them deeper into the woods. Sophie and Alex exchanged uneasy glances. "We should follow it," Alex said, though his voice wavered. "It might lead us to something." Despite their fear, they followed the light. The lantern's glow led them through the twisting forest paths, deeper and deeper into the heart of the woods. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. After what felt like hours, they emerged into another clearing. The lantern was now hanging from a tree, its light casting an otherworldly glow over a large, old wooden cabin. The cabin home was in better condition than the other structures they had seen, but it was still clearly abandoned. The light from the lantern illuminated the cabin, revealing a porch with a creaky swing and a few broken windows. "It's like it's inviting us," Alex said, his voice filled with awe. They approached the cabin cautiously, the lantern's light guiding their way. The front door was slightly ajar, and they pushed it open, stepping inside. The interior was surprisingly well preserved, with old furniture covered in white sheets and dusty chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, but the atmosphere was oddly peaceful. As they explored the cabin, they found old photographs and yellowed papers scattered around. The photographs showed families and people they didn't recognize, but there was one image that caught their attention. A portrait of a stern-looking man holding a lantern. He must have been the caretaker, Alex mused. Maybe this was his home. They continued to search the cabin, finding more clues about its past, but the deeper they explored, the more unsettled they became. The lantern's light had stopped guiding them, and the cabin seemed to grow darker and colder. Suddenly, Sophie heard a noise, a low, mournful wail coming from the second floor. She turned to Alex, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" Alex nodded, his eyes wide. "Let's check it out." They ascended the creaky stairs, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty house. The wail grew louder, more insistent. At the end of the hallway, they found a door slightly ajar, the sound coming from within. Sophie pushed the door open and gasped. Inside the room was an old bed covered in tattered sheets, but it was the figure lying on the bed that made her blood run cold. It was a pale, ghostly woman, her eyes closed as if in a deep, eternal sleep. Beside her was a lantern, its light flickering weakly. As they watched, the lantern's light began to pulse, and the ghostly figure started to stir. Her eyes opened, revealing deep, hollow sockets. She looked directly at Sophie and Alex, her expression one of both sorrow and anger. The wailing grew louder, filling the room with an unbearable noise. Sophie and Alex turned to flee, but the door slammed shut behind them. The room seemed to close in on them, the walls shifting and the air growing colder. In their panic, they grabbed the lantern and stumbled back down the stairs. The ghostly figure followed them, her wails echoing through the cabin. They burst out into the night, the lantern's light casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. They ran back to the clearing, the lantern's light guiding their way once more. As they reached the well, they threw the lantern inside and fled, their hearts pounding in their chests. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, they turned to look back. The cabin was now a dark silhouette against the night sky, and the lantern's light had disappeared. They never spoke of that night again, but the haunting wail and the ghostly figures stayed with them. The legend of the lantern remained a mystery, but Sophie and Alex knew better than to follow its light ever again. The lantern's glow still appears from time to time, leading those who dare to follow it into the heart of the woods. But no one who has seen the light has ever returned, and the wail of the ghostly figure echoes through the trees, a chilling reminder of the dangers that lie beyond the edge of the known world. The Stolen Shadows. In the sleepy town of Ravenswood, nestled deep within the misty valleys, there stood a quaint old bookstore named the Enchanted Page. The shop was known for its eclectic collection of rare and antique books, and its owner, Mr. Harrington, was as much a part of the store as the books themselves. He was a peculiar man, always shrouded in mystery, and he had a reputation for being a bit of a recluse. One chilly October evening, Clara, a curious and determined young journalist, found herself in Ravenswood investigating a series of strange disappearances that had plagued the town for months. Her inquiries led her to the Enchanted Page, where she hoped to find clues or perhaps an understanding of the mysterious events. As Clara entered the bookstore, she was greeted by the musty smell of old paper and the sight of countless bookshelves crammed with volumes of all sizes and ages. Mr. Harrington, with his silver hair and piercing blue eyes, welcomed her with a nod but said little. He was busy organizing some new arrivals, or so it seemed. Clara wandered through the aisles, her fingers trailing over the spines of ancient tomes. Her eyes were drawn to a peculiar book lying on a small, dusty table near the back of the store. It was bound in dark leather, with a gold emblem embossed on the cover, a book she hadn't noticed before. She picked it up and opened it. The pages were filled with strange symbols and illustrations of shadows and silhouettes. There was no text she could decipher, only eerie images of people with their shadows detached or twisted in unnatural ways. Clara's curiosity was piqued. Mr. Harrington appeared beside her, his presence sudden and unsettling. "Ah, I see you've found the Shadow Tome," he said, his low and almost reverent. "That book is not for casual readers. It contains things that are best left undiscovered." Clara was taken aback. "Why? What does it mean?" Mr. Harrington's eyes darkened. "It is said to contain secrets of an ancient ritual, one that can alter the very essence of a person's shadow. Many years ago, there were rumors of people who had their shadows stolen, replaced with something not quite human." Clara's interest was piqued. "Stolen shadows? That sounds like a myth." "Perhaps," Mr. Harrington said, his gaze distant. "But the disappearances you're investigating, some say they are linked to such dark rituals. Those who lose their shadows can sometimes vanish without a trace." That night, Clara couldn't shake off Mr. Harrington's ominous words. She returned to her modest hotel room, but sleep eluded her. She decided to investigate further, believing that the answers might lie in the Shadow Tome itself. She returned to the bookstore the next day under the guise of simply wanting to buy a book, but her real aim was to discover more about the mysterious tome. Mr. Harrington was not in the store when she arrived, so Clara took the opportunity to examine the Shadow Tome more closely. She flipped through the pages, trying to decipher the symbols and illustrations. One particular page caught her attention. It depicted a ritual involving a circle of light and shadows and a phrase written in an ancient language. As she studied the page, Clara noticed something peculiar. Her own shadow seemed to flicker and shift strangely in the dim light of the bookstore. She looked around, but nothing seemed out of place. Just then, Mr. Harrington returned. He noticed Clara's intense focus on the tome, and his expression grew stern. "I warned you," he said softly, his voice laced with concern. "The shadows are not to be trifled with." Ignoring his warning, Clara left the bookstore with the Shadow Tome, her mind racing with theories and questions. That night, she continued to study the book, trying to decipher the ancient language and the ritual described. As the hours passed, Clara's shadow began to behave increasingly erratically. It seemed to move independently, sometimes stretching and contracting unnaturally. Her reflection in the mirror showed her shadow moving in ways that didn't match her own actions. Fearful but determined, Clara decided to follow the instructions from the tome. She drew the ritual circle in her living room, carefully placing candles around it as described. The book instructed her to recite an incantation, which she hesitated but ultimately followed. As she spoke the words, the room grew cold, and the candles flickered violently. Her shadow began to detach from her, writhing and twisting as if struggling to free itself. Clara felt an intense pressure, as though something was pulling at the very essence of her being. The moment the incantation was complete, the pressure released, and the room fell silent. Clara's shadow returned to its normal state, but she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The ritual had worked, but something felt wrong. The next morning, Clara awoke to find her apartment in disarray. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to writhe and move of their own accord. As she looked in the mirror, she noticed that her reflection was not entirely her own. It was as though a dark, sinister version of herself was staring back at her. Clara's phone rang, startling her. It was Mr. Harrington. "I know what you've done," he said, his voice urgent. "You must come back to the bookstore immediately. There are consequences." Panicked, Clara hurried back to the enchanted page. The bookstore was dark, and Mr. Harrington appeared gravely concerned. "The ritual," he explained, "can sometimes attract malevolent entities that feed on shadows. Those who perform it are at risk of becoming shadows themselves, lost to the darkness." Clara's heart sank as she felt the growing presence of something sinister around her. Shadows in the bookstore seemed to come alive, swirling and stretching unnaturally. Mr. Harrington handed her an old amulet, telling her it was a protective charm. She clutched the amulet tightly as the shadows closed in. The bookstore's light grew dim, and Clara felt herself being pulled into the darkness. The last thing she saw was Mr. Harrington's face, etched with a mixture of pity and resignation. The next morning, Clara was reported missing. The bookstore was found abandoned, the shadow tome lying open on the floor, its pages flickering with dark, shifting shadows. The only clue to Clara's disappearance was a single ominous message scrawled in the book. "Those who seek to control shadows may find themselves consumed by them." The legend of the enchanted page grew darker, and the bookstore became a place of whispered warnings. The town of Ravenswood spoke of Clara as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of meddling with the unknown. And sometimes, on quiet, foggy nights, the lantern's light of the enchanted page would flicker on its own, casting eerie, shifting shadows that seemed to beckon the curious, forever luring them into the darkness. The end.